to basically 13%. So this is a very fast-growing space, right? And in terms of the penetration in the banking valuations, so if you add up all the valuation of all the financial services actors, that represents currently 9%, and they expect that to go to 25%. So you can see the catch-up, meaning they're going to catch roughly 9% of revenues, but the valuation catch-up is a lot bigger. So the fintechs will be a bigger part of the big pie of financial service valuation and a smaller part proportionately of the revenues. This is pretty phenomenal. I mean, coming from QED, I don't know, is anybody here from QED? I think everybody knows QED is the founder of, no, QED is Nigel Morris, who actually is an author in this paper, and someone I know well. He was an advisor to BBVA at one point. And what's interesting, I mean, it is a bit of self-serving to say, the future of fintech is so bright. That's kind of the main point of this paper. But to quantify it and give us a roadmap is very interesting because at the end of the day, the valuations are actually down. It used to be the valuations at the peak of this cycle were 20 times revenues. 20 times revenues. What was the average valuation for fintech companies? Now is down to 4 times revenues. There is no bank that I know trading at anything multiple of revenues to begin with, right? Banks trade at multiples of earnings, not of revenues. But the fintech are in a different league because they are basically valued onto multiple revenues. Sometimes, even though they make, I always say, some of these fintechs are just banks. They're lending, but they get multiples of gross interest income sometimes. So it's pretty phenomenal. Now, of course, we can talk about this dynamic of how is this party possible? How can we have this these valuations for the fintechs that in such a different league from the valuations of the traditional banks, right? And I guess hopefully that's something that I can bring some at least ways to think about this. I'm sure you all have been thinking about this already. The interesting issue, and I got a few slides. This is one slide from that Citibank research piece. If you haven't seen this, actually there's 2 documents. They put out 2 papers in 2016 around the future of fintech. And as I say, these are probably the only 2 pieces of research that are readily available around how to think about fintech and how it evolves over time. But this busy slide, what it shows at the time, 2016, they were like, where is the party going to go, right? Where are the fintech disruptors going to go, geographically speaking? So a very simple graph, which has on the one side is, the bottom one was, what's the level of adoption of digital devices? Like how many people have smartphones? That was a question way back then, right? Right now it would be like a silly thing to even talk about, right? Everybody has a smartphone on the planet, right? The question was, but the thread or the theme was, who's got the most to lose, right? And it turns out that the US banks don't have a lot to lose. That sounds pretty counterintuitive, right? Versus who? Versus, say, a British bank or a Spanish bank, because they are big retail players and they're big universal banks. They're playing in every revenue stream in the financial services, including insurance, right? Whereas in the US, as we'll see in a minute, banks, the value chain has been very fragmented, and banks have been kind of pushed out or have chosen to get out of a lot of the value chain. Therefore, they don't have so much to lose. And that was the main theme of this prediction, is that the disruption was going to play out in markets with high digital adoption, where the incumbents had less to lose from the disruption, right? And let's think about this for a second. We didn't think about, fintech was not a noun or a substantive, like 20 years, I wouldn't call it the fintechs, right? It would be like, oh, the fintech company or fintech organization or whatever. So now we've coined this term just to think about organizations, companies that are using technology to disrupt financial services. The other slide I could show you in that study is around where is the money going to? And of course, the money is going to the places which is easier to disrupt. So we saw that the party started in payments, like PayPal, which I like to call the dinosaur of fintech, came to payments because the payments is where the money was. A 5% interchange fee on credit card, man, that's a place where you can make a lot of money, right? You can also lose your shirt, as we all know well, because the credit card space this, has all these issues, whether it's fraud and many other things, right? Well, fraud, not to mention, that fraud is rampant. And if you want to clone a card in the world, used to, before we got the chip on the card, you would clone a US card. So it was clearly the place they went first. And what they left for last, if you think of it, it was mortgages. If we map out like the big waves of fintechs in the US disrupting the value chain, the party came last to mortgages, real estate lending. Why? Because complex, regulatorily super dangerous. I mean, you go to jail for these things that, if you get it wrong, redlining, or, there's so much high risk, regulatorily speaking, but also technology wasn't there either. I mean, to solve for real estate lending, the kind of AI, no, it wasn't called AI, but, the robotics or, machine, those automating the real estate lending process wasn't really ripe in the beginning on PayPal. Remember, PayPal went public in 1999, and it wasn't a unicorn when it went public. It went public below the billion, and then it got over the hump when it was sold to eBay. eBay paid more than $1 billion. We know that the rest is history when it comes to the phenomenal wealth creation that came out of the PayPal and the PayPal founders, right? Now, this is an interesting slide, but there's so many of these. This is one I used to use myself with my BBVA employees. So BBVA came to the US and we bought 6 banks between 2005 and 2007, plus one from the FDIC in 2009. Collectively, we built a bank that was about $100 billion in assets, and it has been recently sold to PNC, and BBVA exited the market. But coming from overseas or from another galaxy to the US, my bankers in Texas, which was where we had 70% of our business, they already had reprogrammed their brains to think, we only do commercial lending and at the time, free checking. That was the lead product in the bank industry at the time. And I don't want to make the joke about free checking, but that was not free, but it was the thing of the day, right? And what I want to show you with this slide is that in the US in particular, this is not applicable to any other jurisdiction, but the financial service value chain is very fragmented. Parts of the value chain, and there's a lot of dead bodies here, as I did on purpose. You got a lot of companies that are no longer in existence or got bought up by Bank of America, the local bank here. But you can see that these banks, traditional banks, had been already pushed out by the monoliners, in a way. That was kind of the revolution of the 90s, out of the mortgage business, banks going out of that. Credit cards for sure. Capital One, six letters a day in your mailbox. The auto loans, same thing. The captives taking that business away from the banks, and they've never been an investment bank and mutual banks. I'm talking about commercial banks generally. Insurance, of course, traditional banks. We used to sell insurance in branches in Spain and all over Latin America, like cookies. And in the U.S., it's impossible to sell insurance in a bank branch because the legislation and the regulation doesn't let you do it, but also it's just intrinsically very complicated as well. So banks are being pushed out of this value chain. So this kind of value chain is perfect for disruption. So again, the point I was making earlier, if you are a smart, I guess they're all either data scientists or engineers out of Carnegie Mellon or Stanford or wherever they were at, or this PayPal folks, some of them were in all kinds of places. They were all basically grad students starting their first business. And where do you start hitting the banks? At the time, it was very conflictual. It was a battle. And they went for payments, but then the story goes, we see that, for example, an interesting case, Max Levchin, who founded PayPal, his, I guess, second, third gig now is a firm, which is a lender, right? So we've seen this disruption come from one part of the value chain to another. But one thing I want you to think about it is that the strategy plays out, and you've heard this theme, by unbundling the value chain. That's been the main trend of fintech disruption. I'm going to solve for a very, very small thing in the pain point of a consumer. And my favorite product or service is called Venmo, right? Venmo, what does Venmo do? It's an ACH on steroids, right? Now would you think like 20 years ago, I would have told you, you're going to start using one app in your phone just to do one little thing, which is make a transfer, right, to someone else, and just put a bunch of like emojis on it and stuff like that. So that is the kind of disruption we're seeing. Very, very targeted unbundling of the value chain. And with my students, I always keep good tab. How many apps do you have on your phone to do your financial services? I'm happy to continue, like this is my personal survey out there. Do you think you have more than 10? Raise your hands if you have more than 10. Okay? Anybody that has more than 20? By the way, think about insurance, your international, and crypto. So that's, I would say, if you have crypto apps, insurance apps, and does anybody here has more than 30 apps to do their? I do. So I'm just like, am I the only one? There's someone else in the back. Okay. So think about it. We have unbundled, right? Whether it's 10 or 5, or if you don't do crypto, of course you probably don't have 10 out of the way right away. But anyway, you see the point, the idea of this unbundling. And there are two themes here as well that are coming now, or at least three themes I would point to that are coming to the theater near us, related to this unbundling process. One is the idea of rebundling, right? Because you don't justify these valuations. Does anybody know how Venmo got started? It's two young men. I think they were either freshmen or sophomores at University of Pennsylvania, and they were trying to buy something from each other. I think it was either an MP3 at the time. There was Napster, or they were trying to buy a ticket to a concert. But it was a music-related event. I don't know if they were foreign-born or foreigners, but their last names, very unusual last names, and they basically started Venmo to solve for that problem on themselves. Now, by the time they had tens and hundreds of thousands of routing numbers and checking account numbers in their servers, somebody knocked at their door and said, "What are you guys doing? Who are you? I mean, how did you start the social payment platform?" And you are just, so they sold very, very early, and they did very well. They sold for, I believe, about $25 million to Braintree, which then Braintree got sold to PayPal when PayPal was like losing the war against Stripe in the mobile payment space. But the idea of this rebundling, we see that with SoFi, for example. You started with student loans, right? You're going to get into all this adjacent territory, all this value chain, so that you can, in a way, I think that's the reason why you justify this huge valuations is because you believe that you're going to be the next traditional bank, kind of rewired. In a way that, in fact, that's another theme. You hear the term super app. That I think FT Partners put out a paper on the whole idea of super app. And there's a lot of people talking about the next super app. Is it going to be Twitter? I mean, a lot of folks, like I wonder, is Elon Musk really trying to build us, the original X.com, a new financial super app, whether it's going to have Dogecoin or Twitter coin or whatever is going to be built on there. And there may be a big financial play in there. There's other people. We've seen the super apps overseas. We've seen them in Asia. We've seen WeChat and Alipay becoming these apps of all things, these kind of reborn universal banking apps coming out of the digital birthplace, right? And then lastly, so last one, super app, the theme, rebundling the super app. Two would be embedded finance, which you've heard anytime you look at a VC report on fintech, you hear embedded finance is the next hot thing. Well, the idea is that the fintechs are enabling getting those financial services built into the processes that they have, that the real economy has, whether it's e-commerce or whatever else that you're doing, making a donation to a not-for-profit. The enablement of all that is there. And finally, I think the one interesting last dynamic I would highlight, I think you all know this stuff, is my favorite new species of bank. And that's called I guess there are different names for it. I call it utility banks. They're either the banking as a service platforms, the open banking platforms. So the Crossover, the Grasshopper, you heard from them yesterday. So these are banks that are just, their business model is, I'm going to provide the plumbing for the fintechs to actually go and nibble at everyone's lunch, right? In a way, if you want to be I wanted to present this as a race today in our conversation, although sometimes it's less of a race, and nowadays a lot of collaboration. But this is the old thing. We tried this at BBVA. We created our own open banking platform at one point. We had the whole API. We published all, a long number of APIs out there. We were a little too early, but it's a difficult business to actually make money as well, and regulators have different views at different times around the risk associated with that kind of a business model. So, which takes me to the big question, which a lot of fintechs, I talk to fintechs all the time and VCs, and this is the question that comes up so often. The question of whether to charter. What are the choices? One of the big choices that fintechs have to make is what's going to be my regulatory configuration and how much derivative regulation I want to take in, because whether if I'm a lender, but I use a bank of record, or a true lender, there's a lot of the regulation spills over to me. And so the question that a lot of fintech founders ask themselves when they get of a certain size is like, well, should I be better? Would I be better being a bank? Or should I apply for a bank charter? And that kind of solves the issue, right? And so we've seen some exceptions. I'm keeping count of this. SoFi owns a bank. Lending Club owns a bank. And Varo has a charter. So this is something we can keep tabs on. We're going to see who exactly is going to take the stance or have think that they want to have get into the prudential regulation, which is unique. The U.S. is the only place in the world that has such clear division between commerce and finance, and the threshold. If I remind you, if you don't remember, if you actually own 25% of a bank, whoever you are, whatever you do for a living, you become a bank holding company, right? So you got to be very careful not to cross that threshold, and that's why, and we haven't seen Apple or Amazon or Meta own a bank, right? We've seen their counterparts internationally do. In fact, Klarna is a Swedish bank, and all these other international competitors actually have banks, and banks are useful when you're funding a business, right? When you're taking deposits. Now, one of the things I would say, big tech, small tech, and fintech, they're not going to go into the core of prudential regulation, in my view, in the foreseeable future. With this administration or any other administration, it's too risky because it stifles their growth. They have to bring the regulator as a partner, and they have to agree on what the growth path looks like. So eventually, it's not sustainable for the aggressiveness of their business models. However, we've seen companies like Apple, nibble around. This is always like playing on the fringes without coming center stage on the regulatory front, whether it's Apple deposits, and you probably saw that they announced Apple Pay Later with MasterCard. So a lot of these things are playing out. Meta is doing a lot of payments internationally through WhatsApp. So all these things are playing out there. And then a few thoughts on the incumbent camp. The incumbent camp, or like I like to call the incumbent camp, and the disruptors camp. And the incumbent camp is really busy now solving big issues, which is this macro shock from the high interest rates that is messing up their businesses, or with the cost of deposits, deposit loss. It's also affecting the way they manage their own asset liability. As we saw, Silicon Valley Bank, this bank just basically had negative equities because of losses in their bond portfolio. So we're at a time where the incumbent camp is going to get caught again in some very big trouble. There's going to be a lot of consolidation. Presumably, we've seen that already, like your local banks, BB&T and SunTrust. I remember their press release when they announced their merger. It was about economies of scale, investing in technology. More of that to come, in addition to the actual deposit liquidity issues that we're seeing. And I think the question I would ask myself is that if I was a disruptor right now, is if the solution of the current liquidity and interest rate crisis is that the too big to fail banks become bigger, what does that business model look like? We've never seen the big banks in the US be responsive enough to really own the market. They are too erratic. They exit and enter markets. I've competed against all of them in Texas, and they're not very predictable. And so they don't have those roots in the community. They're not fast at pricing. And that's why, at the end of the day, community banks, in my view, have an eternal, or a very long-term ability to survive, because the big banks are not going to take their business at the end of the day, their core business at the end of the day. So another issue that I've been paying a lot of attention to is crypto. And in fact, before we started the talk, somebody asked me a question: what do you think about the future of crypto? Is it going to stay, or digital assets, as people like to call them nowadays? And I think my view is that crypto is the money of the internet, and it's an infrastructure that we have for digital money. The internet was born without a layer for value, and the Bitcoin is the first execution of a view that you could have value transacted the same way we transact information on the internet highway, right? And that's paradigm one. Paradigm two, with the advent of Ethereum, is that we have digital money that's programmable, because Ethereum created a fully programmable cryptocurrency, a Turing-complete cryptocurrency. So a programmable digital money, it's a pretty phenomenal way of thinking about the future. And the capacity that this industry has to mutate and evolve is phenomenal, because when you look at stablecoins themselves, actually, it's like turning the whole system on its head. Stablecoins are not really decentralized. There's always somebody is trying to, there's an auditor verifying where the money is, and a bank account where the fiat money is being kept. So by definition, they're not very decentralized, but stablecoins are just giving us a way to get that paradigm of programmable money to the theater near us. And I would pay attention to what some of the big banks are doing in this space. They have entire divisions using smart contracts and solving for traditional banking problems using stablecoins and programmability of money, which you cannot do on ACH and credit card payments. That's why when Facebook wanted to start social payments, they came up with a cryptocurrency to do it. Libra, remember that? And what's his name went to Washington and they just hit him over the head. It's like, hell no, you're not going to control our money and our information. You did such a great job with our information. So this is really the payment infrastructure of the future. And I personally think we'd be better off if the casino phase of this would end soon. I think it's unlikely, because there's an appreciation. What's the logic of appreciation? In a way, the idea is that we're in the investment phase of this infrastructure. So if it gets adopted very quickly, then we would say, well, gee, it's worth a lot more. If this is the next Google, right? Hopefully, your favorite flavor token is actually the next Google, but it could be Alta Vista or Yahoo, right? So we've seen this play out before, where you have this new technologies, new infrastructure, but people are just get very excited about, oh, I'm going to be the next really smart guy out there and just going to make a fortune investing in. So that's why I call the casino phase of crypto. Now, we've seen that the best use case so far of crypto has been as a reserve asset. We've seen this every time, when the weekend of the Silicon Valley collapse, Bitcoin was on fire. Every time the whole system gets reminded that the Fed has a $9 trillion balance sheet, Bitcoin goes up, because there's one of the possible scarce reserve assets out there for sure. And it's been around and it's pretty solid. So, but as I know a lot of bankers, a lot of fintech companies here, what I think is the promised land for fintech or for financial services that comes out of the crypto is really the decentralized finance platform. Because you can build self-executing, open and transparent, real open code on lending and exchange platforms. And somebody, I'm not going to go any further into this, but somebody's going to figure this out sooner or later. There are people like Figure. For example, this is Mike Cagney, the founder of SoFi. His new gig is a company that's called Figure that's making home equity loans using and tracking them on a blockchain that they built. It's called Provenance. And so somebody eventually is going to figure out that this is a new frontier of efficiency to make loans on blockchains. And I've learned one thing over the last decade is that the blockchains that work are the ones that are permissionless. Banks are just trying so hard to like take blockchain out of the public highway, them in their own little corners, and it hasn't worked because there's no ecosystem when you actually move your highway out of the public place. So we'll see more real economy use cases, and then finally, of course, how not to talk about regulation when the SEC has got us all entertained every day with what they're doing next with Binance or Coinbase and so on and so forth. Now, this is an interesting play. I would encourage you haven't been paying attention to what other countries in the world, but in particular, Europe has passed a regulation, the MiCA regulation for crypto. And the problem they're trying to solve, which is very simple, I would say, is the following problem. The security laws of this country were written in 1934. And I don't know how old is Howey test, but it's like probably more than 70 years old. There was no internet, as far as I know, at that time. So we need to adapt our securities laws to these products, which are hybrids. They're securities, they're commodities, they're actually digital assets, currencies. So a new world, and that's the thing that needs. And that takes you to the last two slides I have here. One is, let's go back to the problem at hand, the opportunity in a way, right? If you're a fintech, a bank, if you think of it as playing defense. Look at this. I mean, when I show this overseas, they're like scratching their head. This is like the most, there was a time this is the most popular function in a bank mobile app. And they're like, what are you talking about? What is this? Oh, we're taking a picture of a check. Oh, so you still use checks? Because I started my bank career in 1990 in Madrid, Spain. I had a checkbook, which I still have. I never had to get a second checkbook. And this is many years ago. And this is so risky, right? You're taking a picture of a freaking piece of paper. My wife just got, she got hacked with one of these, and somebody trumped her into depositing one of these and then send the Zelle, and a couple $1,000 net worth negative now for the family. But so the infrastructure is the problem. Like, that's why we have Venmo. Because ACH, NACHA did not give us real-time payments, right? The big banks prefer NACHA to play to their games. Like, if you want real-time, just open the account with me. It'll be real-time, right? If we all have the same too-big-to-fail bank account, then it's real-time for everyone, right? Now, this is very important because this is the core of what the disruption opportunities are coming from in the US. We still don't have FedNow. That could have been. I mean, I know this is a huge debatable question, so feel free to disagree with me on this. But if we have had FedNow like 10, 15 years ago, we probably would be in a different place. The other thing, which is my favorite disruption, the fintech era, are the aggregators. Look at what Plaid has built. I mean, this is just plumbing for financial data that is kind of owned by one company. When you think of it, I don't know if you saw, they recently announced they're going to do real-time payments, and they're going to enable the instant ACH on Plaid. Now, remember who was going to buy them? Do you remember? Visa. And they got, yeah, that went toast. They said, the regulators said, hell no, you're not owning this. We've seen, the question to me is, what's the next mutation likely? Because Plaid, I mean, we had Yodlee for a long time. Aggregators have been around, but to extract the value that this companies can extract, enable, credit scoring systems, cash flow views of, there's so many things that Plaid can provide by just owning that data. We've seen overseas legislators have come into this place and have actually imposed Plaid-like infrastructure. Particularly the UK has an open banking system that forces the banks to actually share the data. The question I would ask myself, and I don't have an answer on this, do you think banks are going to buy the fintechs, right? Is that the solution? Is that part of how the competitive landscape plays out? Are the banks going to be buying? We've seen what happened with Goldman Sachs, Green Sky, right? It's for sale. They tried their own. So Goldman Sachs is a very interesting example to keep on. But we haven't seen a lot of banks buying the big fintechs anyway. And with the valuations at 20-time revenues, that's basically very dilutive and very impossible. So one last thought, and then I want to look at your questions here, is it's not all about infrastructure. It's also about customer service and customer experience. And then this is where the banks need to look at themselves in all honesty, because when you look at the NPS, and this is part of that QED BCG paper, the NPS of traditional banking and financial service institution is something to not be very proud of. I mean, at 23%, 23 NPS, that's the average. And this, I'm sure it has improved a ton, but they're competing against, this fintechs that are, as one of my bankers used to say, is love of banking again. When you get a great app or a great digital solution in your life, you're like, I'm in love with financial services again. And they are able to turn that on, which allows you to go through this rebundling process, once they're giving you something great. There's a few things I can talk about here, but I probably want to spend a few seconds. I haven't been looking at the iPad here on the questions that you all have been throwing here. So let me just quickly look at them. So one of the questions is, what challenges banks facing catching up to fintech? I'm not very optimistic that banks are going to catch up to fintech, not in the US at least. And that's a good point. I think that banks are not in a great place. They're regulatorily in a different sort of galaxy. They're not very agile. And then there's two areas where I think banks still have a lot of work to do. One is digital marketing. And I know some people would disagree. I mean, it's 6,000 banks, so it's hard to generalize. But, and fraud. So banks really are not acquiring clients digitally that well, still. I think they do a good job of servicing existing clients. When the client's already in the door, they can nurture that relationship. But when they have to get the people, and the Russian bots are hitting at them, it's very hard. I mean, some of you in the room are bankers, I know, so you know that I'm speaking the truth on that. Let's see. Yeah, there's a point here about whether the unbundling is actually related to the fact that banks are too slow. Well, here it says literally the banks take too long to get money to borrowers. In the lending space, that's clear. That's one of the things that Lending Club and Prosper innovated on. The idea that, I can be faster. Lending Club was founded by a computer scientist, Renaud Laplanche, and they were solving, they were trying to solve, they were not bankers, they're trying to solve, how do we improve the process and how we get this money faster. So that's a good point. Let me see. The question here around the role of Goldman's efforts to extend its brand to consumer finance, poor strategy or execution. I don't have an inside view. What I've heard is that it's been poor execution. I personally am not surprised that, I've seen this in the traditional banking space where retailers is one breed of bankers trying to solve one issue, then you have the corporate or wholesale bankers have a different world view. And when you get one to say, I'm going to fix the other side of this, it becomes pretty dicey, because some of these guys get or ladies get a PhD in retail banking, coming from wholesale banking, and it turns out that there are some premises that don't really work as they expected. There are more questions here around buy now, pay later. When this came up around what's the expect from buy now, pay later to consumer lending. I used to, when buy now, pay later started, I think I was not the only one that called it point of sale lending. And I think the power of that versus buy now, pay later, with the power of these platforms is that they're right there when you're checking out. Right? And that's the magic of Affirm. You're going to find them, when you're checking out that high-ticket item at Expedia, surprisingly at Gucci. They do a lot of people that buy themselves like a luxury good. And they're just right there at the right time to initiate that financing opportunity. And if you compare Affirm with GreenSky, for example, GreenSky is more of an analog platform. using Home Depot, like analog retail platform versus a firm which is entirely digital. And that is kind of the power of buy now, pay later, in my view. It's more around being embedded in the process of buying versus the loan innovation itself, which is just an installment loan. The economics are so rich, too. That's the thing that makes this company so successful, is because the merchant is willing to chime in as well, right? If I'm going to sell my Gucci handbag, they have a big margin, and they are ready to buy down the rate, ready to actually do other things. That's my view on that. Interesting question about is the outlook for Coinbase post-SEC. I mean, this is a battle that was very predictable. At the end of the day, Coinbase got served a Wells notice. Are you familiar with what that is? The SEC had told them already that they were coming after them. And then Coinbase sued the SEC a couple of weeks ago. So by now, I think it's become the right term. It's a big regulatory battleground. I think the way out of this, as what I mentioned earlier, is the legislators. If we can get our politicians in the Congress to give us rules for the digital asset community and the digital asset world, that's what would solve this problem. Because, like I jokingly say, and I think everybody would agree, the SEC is not an endorsement agency. It's an enforcement agency. So they resist the idea of telling us this is the way to do things. They just want to slap you in the hand and hope that you learned by doing their way. Maybe I'll take one last one here because I think I'm running out of time. Let's see what questions here. There's a few more here, sorry. Which banking products do you expect traditional banks to maintain an advantage over fintechs? I don't think there's anything that traditional banks do. It's just the business model itself, this asset liability play. In fact, a bank is the best configuration to do fintech, right? In fact, fintechs are working so hard at solving for a problem that they would ideally solve if they were able to play asset liability for the most part. Particularly, all the fintechs are either in the lending business or deposits and payments. They're better off if they had a bank. What's interesting, the fintechs that are real, in my view, the fintechs are really the unicorns of value creation, are the ones that are just fee income generators. Like, let's look at Credit Karma, for example, or Plaid. Those, I mean, to me, these are the real mutations of the system. That's where data becomes its own value chain. You're not just trying to redo, lending in the 21st century using data science as well, but not the same thing. So I would stop there. Then one last thought I would leave, which I didn't touch on. The last thing I would talk about, the trend of trying to solve financial health for the consumer. That's also a big theme in the fintech space. I think it's now adopted by many institutions. I'm actually on the board of a credit union, BECU in Seattle, and they're doing a lot of work around financial health. But there's a lot of fintechs that claim to specialize. Well, what's interesting, particularly when you look at credit unions, which are really a mission-oriented organizations, it's interesting to see the fintechs now outmaneuver credit unions at times when they're for-profit organizations and they're just here to solve our financial health, whether it's Dave or Stash or whatever is your favorite sort of like, themed organization that's solving for that. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. I try to keep you as stimulated as possible, but I'll be around if you have any other questions, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Please take the next 20 minutes to refresh your coffee and network with other attendees before resuming the session at 10:30.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Great presentation. I'm Rocky Hunt. I'm with the NCUA. I'm the regulator of credit unions.
I've heard you talk. You spoke at one of our meetings.
Attention, Generations attendees. Please make your way to the FinTech and InsurTech stages for the first breakout session of the day. All exhibits booths and activation activities will reopen during the networking lunch. We will be restarting in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and welcome Aubrey Hawes.
Perfect. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Okay.
It's so good to be back here.
back. I was
Listen,
like,
Aubrey Hawes, thank you for giving me some energy. I appreciate that. So listen, we have an outstanding speaker that's going to join us on stage. His name is Rodney Hood. Rodney Hood is the Honorable Rodney Hood, so he actually is a presidential appointee. He leads the credit union, the National Credit Union Association, as their chief regulator. And what's also exciting is, this is not in his professional bio, he's a Charlottean. He grew up in Charlotte, went to Myers Park High School, so he's a Mustang. And we had a chance to meet over Thanksgiving because he's really looking at trying to determine how I can pull FinTech into the credit union sort of community. Prior to that, he actually was responsible for corporate responsibility at JP Morgan Chase. I'm sure several of you guys have heard of that large bank. He's actually serves as a member of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Board of Visitors. He is a big North Carolina Tar Heel fan and member. And so he also was recognized as a professional award for being one of the top 40 under 40 leaders by the Triangle Business Journal. He currently jointly resides in Washington, D.C. and in Durham. But let's give a big warm welcome to the Honorable Rodney Hood.
Hello, hello.